All right, gentlemen, let's do a part 3 for the Global 10 final exam review. Global 10 final exam review. Remember, blue and black, stuff you got to know. Black's usually titles. Green equals stuff you have to understand. Usually that means writing, although some of the multiple choice, a little complex. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution and the Communist Revolution here, and then the Cold War. So let's take and head to the bottom. I'm going to post all this as a PDF, which won't mean a ton if you didn't watch the videos. So, part 3 video, Cold War and beyond. So let's talk first about the Russian, sometimes called the Bolshevik Revolution. All right. So we are talking into World War I. Russia is way behind industrializing. Therefore, huge income gap. The serfs are living hard lives of manual labor. Right? The Russians didn't really need to industrialize. They had a lot of serfs. We are talking about the leftovers from a system of feudalism going all the way back to the Middle Ages, right? And so Russia's behind on these things. And we are seeing also, to add to those economic, right? We're talking here about economic factors. We're also talking about the political factor of nationalism. As opposed to feudalism, the creation of what we would call a nation state, right? And so we're talking about political and economic factors. I'm just checking out my notes here. So, going in order, we have Lenin. He begins to industrialize once he comes to power. Talking about 1917. The communists pledge get Russia out of World War I because they didn't industrialize. We're talking about lack of industrialism equals low tech. Supply problems. Who bears the brunt of this during World War II? World War I? Therefore, lower economic classes suffer greatly. Right? Should add here aristocrats are usually the officers who suffer a little bit less and more than the others, right? But we can see this technological and economic factor is also leading to a political uproar, right? This idea of feudalism. So Lenin begins to industrialize. When Lenin dies, Stalin comes after Lenin. Now, I should go back up here. Leninism does not necessarily equal Marxism. It's a level up. Lenin's is more extreme. Okay. And I am very much oversimplifying. Oversimplify. I am very much oversimplifying this, and as well as down here. Okay, so Stalin comes after Lenin. He is even more extreme. He does something called Russification, which means to homogenize and this is important. This is why here, and this video is being made in June 2022, we have ongoing problems in the Ukraine and the Crimea, right? Because there's a battle of nationalism again. Okay? So that battle, that idea of nationalism keeps coming up. But you might argue, or Stalin would certainly argue, need authoritarian power to catch Russia up. All right, so you may make that argument that you need I wouldn't make it, but Stalin would. Clearly I wouldn't, because I'm more in my classroom about you guys figuring out what is important to you a bit on your own, right? A more authoritarian teacher might take charge and kind of force you into learning. But anyways, he's trying to catch up. This is when we have those 5-year plans. They're about economics. When we get to China's basic version, sort of the same, not exactly, is the Great Leap Forward. And there's some other more sophisticated versions of it after you get through Mao and into some of the more recent communist leaders in China. And even President Xi today, you might argue. So, and I wanted to go back up here because I forgot an important thing. I always find it very interesting. You got the Imperials. They're going to be called the Whites versus the Communists. They're the Reds, which is why communism gets that kind of propaganda. And I always find it interesting. There's another new Star Wars thing coming out, the Obi-Wan Kenobi series there. And in Star Wars, the Imperial Guards are the red troops. But if you're not a Star Wars fan, you're not following me anyways. But that is a pretty big, quick overview of Russia, World War I to World War II. Now, after World War II, we're talking about the Cold War. And we're going to talk about glasnost. Well, first we'll go during the Cold War. There was this idea of brinksmanship, right? And it's related to the nuclear arms race and a concept called mutually assured destruction. This idea that there was enough nuclear weapons they could destroy the whole earth a few times over. Right? And so this is why we have a lot of proxy wars during the Cold War. But I'm getting a little far afield there. But brinksmanship during that Cold War, that will give way eventually to détente, which is a loosening, a move towards democracy. Then we'll have glasnost, perestroika, Eastern European nations are looking for democracy and whatnot, right? And so forth. But I'll talk about that again more specifically when I go through the whole Cold War thing as a separate topic, right? But we should attribute this before I go and do China. Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, right, is the guy associated with this stuff. And I'm going to move these things into green because it shows a little bit more about understanding. The Central Asian republics, a former student jokingly called them the stands. You could also see movement there in talking about like Georgia, Chechnya, etc. But we went into a lot of detail when we did that. All right, now let's take a look quickly then at the path of communism in China. China's communism. All right. So again, they are also pre and during World War I, beginning to resist old, we wouldn't really call it feudalism, but for the sake of this, an old kind of feudalism. China too, because it saw itself as the Middle Kingdom. If you recall back to 9th grade, which is what I was covering here, they tried to end imperialism. They tried to keep isolated from the West. This idea, don't need what the West has. And you could even go further into this and call that a balance of trade issue, which is when you get into the Opium Wars. That doesn't look spelled right, but you get it. Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, Excuse the bad writing. Let me give it another shot here. The idea of the Boxer Rebellion. Just making sure I didn't cover anything. Okay. The key leader here we're going to talk about is Mao Zedong. And you might see it spelled in some different ways versus Chiang Kai-shek. Again, you might also see that transliterated differently. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, they are eventually going to get pushed out to Taiwan, which is why people in Taiwan see themselves as separate. But the Chinese people kind of say that they're Chinese. It's kind of like if you moved out into the apartment above your parents' garage. You feel like you're an independent guy, but your parents are still paying, and they think that they're in charge, right? So, Mao Zedong is an important leader. Unlike in Russia, with urban workers, Chinese communists focus on peasants. This has a long history. I was just doing the review videos the other day for the freshmen, and this goes back even into freshman year. Goes back into the idea of Confucianism in Global 9, right? So peasants, Mao during the Cultural Revolution, lionizes. I think that's the right word. He makes them heroes, exalts them. Again, man, I'm trying to get this done, and the writing's mess. He exalts. He does a lot of other things during this Cultural Revolution deal. He wants to expel the old ways. Cultural Revolution, it backfires on Mao. Other economic and cultural. China is not a democracy, at least not yet. Right? Backfires on Mao. Let's see. Remember, just to reiterate, his economic progress we call the Great Leap Forward. I always remember, and I know I assigned it. It was a failure of sorts. I gave you guys a couple crash course videos. I remember one specifically with an animation of how you make steel blowing up. In people's backyards. Right? And so that's an important part of China's, and I think I've covered China. Let's move into more specifically some of the Cold War stuff. as its own concept aside from the communist revolutions. So, one of the key things, you'll often hear this called the Iron Curtain, right? The Iron Curtain. It separates communists from the West. The communists would say, because they don't want materialist and greed, they want people to work together, right? Collectivize is a key word, right? They want people to work together. Communists would say because they want to block it out because of the West. Communists want to keep out the materialism and greed of the West. They want people to commune or work to collectivize. It fails, and the standards of living in most communist nations is low. You might today think of North Korea. Right? And I showed you in class, or I had you watch a clip from a show called Deutschland 83, right? East and West Germany. Right, that stark contrast in just a few minutes of that TV show I showed you guys. So that's the Iron Curtain. Let's see. So then we're going to talk about containment. Actually, I'm going to skip that for now. I'm going to move that down. Go down. We're going to talk about post World War II. You need to know what the Marshall Plan was. What was the Marshall Plan? The Truman Doctrine. There's one more I want to mention. Truman Doctrine, post-war. Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine. Can't think of the last one. Oh, the Berlin Airlift. As an example of those things, right? Now, part of that has to do with this idea of containment or the domino theory. Containment and the domino theory. This also leads to proxy wars. Russia and the U.S., USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, versus the United States of America. They do not square off directly, except for maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's as close as we came to some concept called MAD. Mutually... I'm going to rewrite that neater, if my iPad works here. Mutually assured destruction. All right. Some of the idea there. All right. Actually, I'm going to rotate these two things around. Probably frustrating at home if you're trying to do this on paper, but anyways, proxy wars. U.S. and the United Nations in Korea v. the Chinese, not quite directly, the French, and the U.S. in Vietnam. Another important proxy war, very similar, USSR in Afghanistan, etc. The term Third World comes out of this. These are often countries that weren't really quite to the industrial standards, etc., etc. But I'm going to put that in a lighter blue. So that's a more complex topic than we need right now for a review. Okay, back on target. So we talked about containment or the domino theory. Containment, the idea of don't let communism spread. I'm going to do it in green. Don't let communism spread. Dominoes, remember, if you were a little kid, you set up dominoes in a row, click, 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 and you knock one over, and then they all fall down, right? So this fear that if one country becomes communist, there'll be a domino theory. And there's some evidence that that was kind of a legit concern. But let's go fast forwarding. We'll talk about the 1980s into 1990s. Right? We talked about glasnost, perestroika, easing. We saw democracy coming. Oops. The breakup of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into the different nation states. I always like to put a side note here, especially since it's pretty interesting stuff. Putin, like Napoleon, gets a name for putting down. My writing is getting messy. I'm going to restart that. Putin, not unlike Napoleon, gets a name, a reputation for suppressing, name or reputation, man, suppressing uprisings. And we saw that, what did Napoleon do? Becomes a dictator. They gain power, dictator type. Right? They gain those powers. All right, so let's take a look at the other parts of the modern world, or a summary. Other parts of the modern world. All right, I'm going to move that down to the next page in case any of you clowns want to print this off and take it on the bus with you. All right, so let's talk about India. So post World War II, they're finally going to get self-rule, and the partition between Muslim, Hindu parts. What are the Muslim ones? Pakistan and East Pakistan, which becomes its own country later and is now Bangladesh. Right? Hindu is what we would now call India. There's a third group in there, the Sikhs. They're kind of stuck in the middle. And I showed you guys a bunch of videos about Kashmir, right? How do you remember this division, right? And I talked earlier video about the what do you call it? The conflicts there and the divide and conquer of the British, and whether it was deliberate or not, right? I personally don't know enough about it to make a claim one way or other than to bring your attention to that kind of idea, okay? Make sure you know this word partition. Part means to divide, right? And so we have a couple different modern nation states now out of it. Okay, next up, let's talk about the Middle East. I just took a look at a religion test and the Global 10th grade religion test. Won't say much, but they had some similar questions to a lot of what we talked about, but especially down in here. Let's talk first about the creation of Israel. 1948, land from the Palestinians. Okay, that's important. And therefore, conflict with Muslim, often you'll see it labeled Arab neighbors, but I don't think that's quite accurate. I think that's too loosely worded, too loosely used a term. The term is used too loosely. Let me rewrite that whole junk over. Is that name used too loosely here? That's a question that I would like to answer. Right, that's maybe a broader question. Again, being a global history teacher, I can't know all the details of all this, but that's important, right? And so, conflict with Muslim neighbors, we have a series of wars. Generally, Israel wins. Eventually, we will have the Camp David Accords. Oops. I want that to be blue. Because they meet at Camp David, right? Basically, and very, very oversimplified, again, I'm worried about using that term. Specifically Egypt, they're kind of the lead there. Jordan. Agree to recognize Israel. There are groups there that we talked about, and I showed you some videos about over the last couple of weeks of school, that claim that Israel has no right to even exist, which is exacerbating lots of the problems, right? But basically, oversimplified, we get to kind of a stalemate of sorts, right? And they kind of agree to disagree, and they leave it at that. And I gave you a bunch of videos, primarily from the Vox News and so forth. All right, let's talk about some parts of modern-day Africa. We can talk about Egypt. they become a democracy. Okay. Another one down in sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about the nation, and I don't mean, see how I'm using a capital letter there? I mean the actual nation of South Africa and the Boers, the former Dutch, the whites, they're actually called Afrikaners, the whites. They try to maintain power via a system of racism called apartheid. You may recognize the name Nelson Mandela, and by you may recognize, I mean you better recognize the name Nelson Mandela, and he is from the African, famous leader, very remarkable, African, the ANC, African National Congress, and he helps bring an end to apartheid and sets up the country. I think that is everything I wanted to make sure we covered. This by no means covers all of the important stuff. Again, this is just a quick review, going through some of the main ideas of Global 10 second semester. All right, so we talked about, just to summarize quick, all right, we talked about imperialism of the 1800s. Leads into World War I, World War II. That leads into the Cold War. You can jam in here. Communist revolutions. USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. China. I'm not sure why I put those in quotes, or excuse me, parentheses. Right, they fit in there in that time frame, and then they go up into here, right? And then we have the New World Order, which is an often misunderstood, thrown around phrase, but that's it. Thanks, boys. Good luck on the exam.